80 tons of riveted steel, tracks stretching the length of a cricket pitch, a single prototype that looked like it had rolled straight out of the trenches of 1918, yet was built in the middle of the Second World War. This is the story of TOG II, the most anachronistic tank Britain ever produced. By September 1940, Britain stood alone. The beaches of Dunkirk had witnessed the evacuation of over 300,000 men, but left behind were the tanks, hundreds of them, abandoned in the French countryside or scuttled in shallow waters. Churchill's island fortress faced a terrifying reality. The army that had escaped had done so without its armor. In the War Office, panic mingled with determination. Britain needed tanks, lots of them, and quickly. But one man looked at the disaster in France and saw something different. Sir Albert Stern had been there before, not at Dunkirk, but at the Somme, at Cambrai, at Amiens. He was one of the fathers of the original tank, a member of the Landships Committee that had birthed the rhomboid monsters that crossed no man's land a generation earlier. Now, at age 60, Stern believed the war ahead would mirror the war behind. He envisioned a return to trench warfare, a new Western Front stretching across Europe, barbed wire and concrete bunkers, minefields and anti-tank ditches. He convinced himself that the Blitzkrieg was an aberration, a fluke that worked only because France had been unprepared. The War Office, desperate for solutions, listened. In February 1940, even before Dunkirk, a committee had been formed, the Special Vehicle Development Committee, but everyone called it by another name, the Old Gang. Stern surrounded himself with veterans of the First World War tank program, men who had designed the Mark I, the Mark IV, the Mark V, men who understood mud and wire and the grinding, crawling warfare of attrition. Together, they would create TOG, the tank, Old Gang. The specification they wrote read like a letter from 1917. The tank must cross trenches 4.8 meters wide. It must crush barbed wire emplacements. It must smash through concrete obstacles. It must be immune to any anti-tank weapon the enemy possessed. Speed was irrelevant. Maneuverability was secondary. What mattered was unstoppable forward momentum. The design that emerged was extraordinary in its deliberate obsolescence. TOG I appeared first in October 1940. But it was TOG II that became the final expression of Stern's vision, completed in May 1941. Picture a metal cathedral on tracks, 10 meters long, 3.3 meters wide. A hull that sat high off the ground like an ocean liner, its vertical sides rising like cliff faces. The tracks ran the entire length of the vehicle, exactly as they had on the rhomboid tanks of the Great War. Ground contact length, over 8 meters. The physics were simple. Spread that 80-ton weight over as much track as possible, and the tank would float over soft ground where others would sink. But this was no mere copy of a Mark IV. The Old Gang had learned some lessons. The hull was cast and welded, not riveted throughout, though rivets still appeared in places like nostalgic reminders. The armor was substantial, 114 millimeters on the frontal arc. Enough, in theory, to defeat any anti-tank gun in 1941. The sides carried 76 millimeters. Even the roof, often neglected on tank designs, was protected against airbursting shells. Inside, the crew of 6 moved through a space that felt more like a ship than a fighting vehicle. The driver sat at the front in a separate compartment. Behind him, the engine. Behind that, the fighting compartment. and mounted in a turret that protruded from the roof like a periscope housing sat the main armament, a 17-pounder anti-tank gun. This was actually remarkable. The 17-pounder would not enter general service until 1943. It was Britain's answer to German heavy armor, capable of penetrating over 100 millimeters of steel at 1,000 meters. Someone on the old gang had possessed enough foresight to understand that firepower mattered, even if they had forgotten that mobility did too. The engine was a Paxman Ricardo 12-cylinder diesel, 600 horsepower. In a lighter tank, it might have provided adequate performance. In TOG II, it pushed the mechanical limits of what was possible. Maximum speed, 13 kilometers per hour on roads, perhaps 8 cross-country, the same speed an infantryman could sustain at a jog. The transmission was electric. Current flowed from the engine to generators, then to electric motors that drove the tracks. This allowed for smooth control and eliminated the need for a complex gearbox, but it added weight and complexity. Miles of wiring ran through the hull like a nervous system. Ground pressure was low, as intended, just under 14 pounds per square inch. For comparison, a Churchill tank exerted nearly 50% more pressure, despite weighing 30 tons less. On paper, TOG II could indeed cross soft ground. But paper and mud are different things. The prototype cost over £20,000 to build. A Churchill cost £6,000. A Cromwell, £5,000. For the price of one TOG, Britain could field 4 modern cruiser tanks. Still, the old gang pressed forward. Testing began at the Fighting Vehicles Proving Establishment. Engineers measured speed, turning radius, obstacle crossing ability. The tank could indeed cross a trench 4.8 meters wide. It could climb obstacles. It could crush wire. But it could not climb hills without overheating. It could not turn quickly. The electric transmission generated enormous heat. The suspension, archaic despite its length, jolted the crew over rough terrain. And most damningly, by 1942, the war had moved on. There would be no new Somme, no grinding trench battles. Instead, North Africa saw sweeping, mobile engagements across empty desert. The Soviet Union witnessed encirclements on a continental scale. Even in Western Europe, when the Allies finally returned, they would come not to siege lines, but to breakout and pursuit. The old gang had designed a masterpiece for a war that would never happen. Only one TOG II was ever built. TOG II never saw combat. Not a single shot fired in anger. Not one trachea laid in enemy territory. The prototype spent its entire service life doing what all failed experiments do, being tested, evaluated, and quietly sidelined. Through 1942 and 1943, the tank made occasional appearances at trials and demonstrations. Senior officers would arrive, walk around the behemoth, peer into hatches, and ask the same questions. Why is it so slow? Why is it so heavy? What battlefield role could it possibly fulfill? The answers satisfied no one. In September 1943, TOG II made its most public appearance. The Tank Museum at Bovington hosted a demonstration of British armoured vehicles for visiting dignitaries and military observers. TOG II lumbered onto the demonstration ground alongside Churchills, Cromwells, and the latest American Shermans arriving under Lend-Lease. The contrast was devastating. While other tanks maneuvered, accelerated, and showcased their agility, TOG II simply existed. It drove forward. It stopped. It traversed its turret with ponderous dignity. Observers noted that it looked impressive, certainly, intimidating even. But impressive in the way a battleship is impressive, powerful, expensive, and utterly wrong for the task at hand. One officer was heard to remark that it reminded him of a submarine attempting to fight on land. All that armor, all that weight, all that specialized engineering for crossing obstacles that no longer existed on any battlefield Britain was fighting on. Compare it to its contemporaries, and the obsolescence becomes stark. The Churchill infantry tank, Britain's actual heavy tank of the war, weighed 40 tons. It carried comparable armor, moved at nearly twice TOG II's speed, and could actually navigate the confined roads and bridges of European battlefields. More importantly, Churchills were in production, thousands of them, rolling off assembly lines and into combat from North Africa to Northwest Europe. The Soviet KV-1 heavy tank, operational since 1939, also weighed around 45 tons. It mounted a formidable 85mm gun, carried heavy armor, and crucially, it worked. Slow by Soviet standards, yes, but effective in the defensive battles of 1941 and 1942, where its armor proved nearly invulnerable. Even the German Tiger, which would not appear until late 1942, weighed 57 tons. Heavy, certainly. Difficult to produce and maintain. But the Tiger could reach 38 kilometers per hour on roads. It could maneuver. It could fight the mobile battles that actually characterized the Second World War. TOG II could do none of these things. At 80 tons, it was too heavy for most bridges. Its width made it difficult to transport by rail. Its ground pressure advantage meant nothing when it could not reach the battlefield in the first place. And that 17-pounder gun, impressive though it was, sat in a tank that could neither pursue a fleeing enemy nor retreat from a dangerous situation. The British Army made its decision through inaction. No production order ever came. No tactical doctrine was written around the vehicle. No crew training program commenced. TOG II simply remained at Bovington, occasionally moved for demonstrations, mostly left alone. The old gang disbanded quietly. Sir Albert Stern returned to private life, his vision of a new trench warfare proven utterly wrong. The other committee members, veterans of the First World War's tank revolution, faded back into retirement. They had been right once, in 1916, when they imagined a way to break the stalemate of the Western Front. But wars do not repeat themselves, and the generals who win the last war rarely understand the next one. By 1944, TOG II was effectively a museum piece, while still technically an active prototype. It sat in storage as D-Day came and went, as Allied armor raced across France, as the war became exactly what Stern had insisted it would not be: mobile, fluid, and utterly unlike the Somme. The tank was never scrapped. That, at least, was a mercy. After the war, it remained at Bovington, where it resides today. The Tank Museum recognized what TOG II truly represented. Not a failure, precisely, but a monument to military conservatism. A warning against fighting the previous war. A reminder that experience can become obsolete as quickly as armor plate. Most visitors walk past it with confused expressions. It looks nothing like their mental image of a Second World War tank. Too tall, too long, too strange. Children ask if it is from World War I. In a sense, it is. TOG II was forgotten because it deserved to be forgotten. Not through any fault of its engineering, which was actually quite sophisticated. Not through poor construction, which was solid. but because it was an answer to a question history never asked. 80 tons of irrelevance. A footnote in armor development. A curiosity that proves vision without flexibility is blindness. The last tank designed to win the First World War. If you want to discover more machines built for wars that never came, subscribe to see what other forgotten relics we uncover from history's scrapyard.